Hi, my name is Chris Coulter, and I'm one of your intrepid co-hosts of All In, the Sustainable Business Podcast. I have one of my other intrepid co-hosts, David. Hi, David. How are you today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you, Chris. And you?
I'm good. And we have an equal number of very special guests that we're ready to dive into conversations on. Where is sustainable business? Where's it been? Where are we going? And I can't think of two better guests who have been deep into this space for many years. Froydis, Cameron, want to say it's wonderful to have you here. And you're in Sweden right now, but say a quick hello.
Hello, I'm Froydis Cameron-Johannson. It's great to be here. A bit about myself. I'm now going to sound very old, but I've been in the sustainability space in various sort of shapes and forms for probably like the last 30 years. I know. So when I was asked to come and do this, I felt very flattered, very honored, but also just made me really reflect on, I guess, that journey over those sort of 3 decades and how much has actually changed. So really looking to have the conversation and to hear from the likes of such sort of interesting people who've also been around this block, like you guys, and of course Manuel as well.
Well, let's start, Manuel Baigorri. You're also one of those interesting people that have been doing lots of work over the years. How long have you been in the space for, Manuel?
Yeah, well, I came into sustainability from the EHS side back in 1997. So also you can count that I'm around. I mean, the years that I've been around too. At a time when the work was much closer to compliance, operations, risk control, that the broader agenda that we are talking today. Quite early on, that expanded into social labor, even product safety. At that point of time, with the EHS team was dealing and labor were doing with all those topics at that point of time. Professionally, I started in the food sector in Spain. Spent many years at Levi Strauss & Company. Later led sustainability at the Hong Kong Jockey Club. So I have also served on boards like Zero Discharge or Hazardous Chemicals and Better Cotton initiatives. And and that is really where my point of view comes from for some success stories. A lot of challenging stories as well we can cover. I mean, because of course you learn from mistakes. And and I have seen as well the function evolve over time from 30 years ago, where at that point of time at Levi's, we were talking about codes of conduct, the code for environment, the code for health and safety, the code for labor, until the day of today, where I think that we've made a very great progress. So even if sometimes we can feel that we don't, but we've done it.
And that's great. 3 different industries, right? Food, apparel with Levi's, and then with gambling, entertainment. Then the philanthropy part of the Jockey Club's a big deal. But and Froydis, your background, of course, I've known you in the mining world, but what's
So a bit like Manuel, I've been sort of straddling sustainability and the HSES world, but also the sort of government policy, public policy space. So I sort of started off wanting to be a glaciologist.
What is a glaciologist?
I know, right? I mean, talk about a profession that's going out pretty quickly. I just I did a lot of research and from my studies, and then I thought somebody was going to pay me to like live on a mountain, which sounded idyllic. Anyway, I quickly moved on from that, and I've basically spent 30 years in the extractive sector. So I started off in oil and gas with Shell. So working, actually, part of my sort of journey on that was working with the very first sustainability team that they had. So that was fascinating. And then probably the last close to 20 years have been in mining. So both for Anglo American and then also for Rio Tinto most recently. So I've just stepped down from being the head of HSES for Rio Tinto. And again, really seeing this sort of change and evolution through the different life cycles, a bit like you, Manuel, of exploration, where you're really going out and finding the resources, to project development, to actually building something, to mining something. And then, of course, now what's becoming even more important is legacy and closure, and how you're actually managing what that looks like, once the resources have gone, both from an ecological perspective, but then also from a socio-political and economic as well.
And I keep saying to my students, master's students, and so on, that this is a field which has massively evolved during the time that I've been involved, as you both have and Chris has. But how would you sort of typify some of those big changes that we've seen over the last 30 plus years?
Manuel, you want to go?
Yeah, I can give it a try. I would say that we've been we are, over the last 30 years, we were in a kind of adolescent period of time, but we've been building up at the speed, creating frameworks and taking more things on board, and building up, basically, especially from the early times where stakeholder engagement, I'm thinking about 3 decades ago, where even you didn't have peers or professionals around, but that basically was the thing. I remember in the textile sector, just meeting 3 big brands and ourselves and wondering, okay, but now what do we do? And there were not even agenda. It was just completely open-ended.
Yeah.
Till the moment when we are today, that we have all those different coalitions. So I would say that this period of forming where things are starting to be together. I think I would say that the first decade. Later on, of course, we got into it, the CSR movement, which I think it did quite a lot instead of start framing things, and as well that we cannot ignore the NGO world, where I think in specific sectors they play a critical role in driving the agenda. At least on textiles, where I spent almost most of my career, they really play a fundamental role to really push the envelope, and you have successful stories like, I don't know, zero discharge of hazardous chemicals, where from a campaign with Greenpeace on detox, later on it became an industry organization that is changing the game, basically. And then we just move into much more structured, functional role, where, AGRI reporting, all those big frameworks start playing around, and it's becoming into the agenda. I think it was important to acknowledge that there were better times. I think that what we need as well to bring into the discussion today is the context that we were dealing with in each of those, let's say, decades or periods of time. Later on, we can talk about what is happening right now, because that's a completely different ball game of what is the challenge that we have ahead, even if I'm optimistic. And I think, through tough times, you can come up with very good outcomes, but that's a different story. And of course, from there, we just move into the ESG period, which from one side is being good, move the agenda, but in the other side is been quite confusing for organizations and leadership levels. I remember in one of the first meetings that I have with leadership when I changed jobs, and the first slide in the deck was one bucket: what is sustainability? What is ESG?
Yeah.
Literally, slide number 1, because everybody has a definition. And basically blow up the whole presentation. We spent 30 minutes on the thing, and I have 40. So I think that, it's been a great progress. Some fundamentals has not been changed. The context has become much tougher right now. But I think what has not been changed, if I'm looking behind and where we are today, is the importance of the issues themselves. And I think that we need to make it simple. Climate still matters, nature, human rights, more than ever. And companies still have to deal with it, because we have more regulation. Still, we have social media. I think that has been, if well used, it's been a good thing as well. Keep people accountable. And yeah, I went a little bit all over the place, but I think that
No, that's great.
it's been great. I mean, if I'm looking when I'm talking to more younger professionals and say, look, you might have the feeling, or you could have the feeling that we are not making progress. But when I see myself just performing a risk assessment or just checking the pH in a wastewater treatment plant when I was in my 20s, where we are today, and I have to really explain or justify my existence in an organization. Today, we are in a much more different place, which gives me confidence that we've made a very good progress.
I totally agree that, particularly for our younger listeners and viewers, understanding just how much progress has already been made, despite the sense that, gosh, there is so much to be done. But it is important to have that sense of perspective. And we'll definitely come on to where we are today and how we respond to today's circumstances. But Froydis, perhaps just first of all, your sense of the evolution that we have collectively lived through.
Yeah, no, Manuel, thank you. It's so interesting to hear from other sectors. I'm always so fascinated by it. I feel very boring just being in one sector for so long. But I think when I first came into it, when I first joined Shell, I was busy doing this. I came in doing sort of a lot of data analytics for sort of the exploration and production and the upstream stuff. And then there was this tiny team called the Sustainable Development Team, and it had about 4 people in it. And I'd heard about it and I thought, oh, that sounds really cool. And because I was sort of quite an internal activist anyway, it was kind of just after the Brundtland definition had come out, and it really resonated with me and how I kind of saw the world. And I'd grown up and traveled a lot around lots of sort of different countries and seen lots of different sort of systems. I've been exposed to lots of different environments. So I was really sort of thought, wow, gosh, what do they do? Anyway, through a very random, and
you were searching for glaciers still. You're still trying to, maybe they do glaciers.
I was, yeah. But anyway, I sort of inquired about it, and then they asked me to apply for a job. And so I was like, yeah, cool beans. So I ended up being part of this very, very small team. And the really interesting part was and again, exactly to your point, David, context. So when I was there, it was literally a year or a couple of years after Shell had been through some really difficult reputational challenges, both with the sinking of the Brent Spar oil storage facility in the North Sea, and then also, of course, big human rights allegations with Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria. So Shell really kind of recognized they needed to do something different. Now, I know organizations, especially corporates, are a sort of combination of people and the dynamics of people. But fascinating for me, I got to work really closely with somebody, the CEO at the time, who is one of the most sort of inspirational corporate figures, I personally think, and that was Sir Mark Moody-Stewart. And he himself, he's got a very interesting background, and part of his own personal beliefs, I think, have really contributed to the fact that he was like, okay, we have to do things differently. And it was through his leadership that he sort of challenged the organization to set up this team, and then also really re-engage with society, because the way a lot of corporates, I think, at the time were behaving, especially in the extractives, and to be fair, they still need to learn a lot about this stuff, is there's a difference between kind of what I would say talking at and engaging with. And so, of course, a lot of sort of corporates, especially in the extractives, a lot of engineering brains, it's all about, here is a boat ton of data. This will prove to you my point, as opposed to, let's have a conversation about what your understanding the situation is, and then how we can have that engagement. And it was really interesting, because that was really part of what one of my jobs was at the time, was to reset that dialogue with society, and how you actually have some of these conversations around the big issues. And a lot of what I had to do initially was to go to a lot of different countries, places, communities, and actually hear what they had to say about the industry and about the company. And it was the first time the organization had actually sort of said, hey, what do you think about us? And, the sort of download that you got was really quite confronting. And also for him, for Sir Mark, Greenpeace were protesting outside of his house, and big sort of, I'm sure you've seen it, reputational engagement case study, he invited them into tea to actually hear
in the movie The Corporation. It's a great scene. Yeah.
Exactly. So, being able to work, and I was super young, but I had a real appreciation for, actually, I was working with somebody who was really quite visionary in the space. And really being able to, what I then found looking back at my career was a lot of what I've had to do in my job, especially in the sustainability space, is bring the outside world in to help the organization understand how society is changing. Because, of course, to your point, again, David, on context, context is dynamic. It's always changing. And so, we think as organizations, we're being innovative and creative, etc. But are we actually really understanding the context in which we're operating, and how are we sort of making sure that feedback loop is coming back? And so I think for me, a bit like what you're saying, Miguel, how far we came from, before it was, 30 years ago, it was very much about compliance. And then I think with the Brundtland report coming out and the definition, how that then got us to think slightly differently, apart from just sort of environmental compliance or safety compliance. And then I think the other biggest one is the social side and bringing that in. And so how that sort of social and community component, when I was 30 years ago, that was the big thing that was coming in. And then the evolution over time on that social bit. So, when you look back at what did the extractors do for social investment in the 70s, it was like, oh, we'll just give you a hospital because we think you need that. And then, of course, you've got all these white elephants around all these resource-rich countries because they've got infrastructure, but nobody running them. So it wasn't done in consultation with the government or with the community, and you didn't have that kind of building of something together. And then, as you said, Manuel, going to sort of the CSR space, again, I found that sort of still very sort of, hey, we know best what you need. We're going to give you all this money. And then the going into that, actually, it's about that co-creation. It's about that participation. It's about that ability to say no. That's, again, where I think we've sort of evolved to in terms of how do you actually co-create some of these big projects and infrastructure in a way that does have that sort of sustainability and all of its works of frame at the core. And that, I think, has been one of the biggest sort of, I guess, evolutions over time, is how you bring it all together, and then how it really becomes a core foundation of how you move forward together on a lot of these projects, especially in the extractive space, which are so sort of impactful, both in terms of their footprint, especially mining, but then also with oil and gas, how that's going to affect the economy ultimately as well. And I think, sorry, just one last thing I'd also say, Manuel, you made it such a good point, is the different stakeholders that have come in to kind of have that influence. And so again, the NGOs, and how they actually thought, you know what, we're just sort of throwing stones at these corporations and they're not listening. They actually changed their MO, and they basically went to the investors. And actually, once the investors started caring, that's when companies started really caring. So what I remember, it was probably about 12, 13 years ago, when the climate sort of debate and discussion really kind of kicked off. I remember I was at a mining company at the time, and I said to the exco, I was like, look, everybody's talking about climate change outside. We need to actually be able to articulate what our position is. We have a coal business. How are we going to frame this? What are we actually going to be talking about? And they're like, nobody's asking us that question, Froydis. And I remember speaking to the investor relations, like, are you getting any incoming from the investors on that? He goes, nah, the only incoming I'm getting is from the socially responsible investors, and I just send them to you. And it was really the way...
They're not real investors.
They're not real investors.
Yeah.
And then 2 years later, I remember I was speaking to the CFO, and he was about to go off on roadshows. And I was like, hey, do you want a bit of a briefing on the human rights space, the climate space, all the stuff that we're doing? I think it might just be helpful for you to have as background. He's like, yeah, sure, no problem. So I gave him that, and he said, and he came back and he's like, oh my gosh, this year it's completely flipped. It used to be that the investors would have a clipboard with a list of questions that their CSI investors would ask them, and they just ticked a box. And he said now those guys were in the room, and over half of the meeting was on their stuff. And so I think that was the flip where we really, I don't want to say the good old days, but I think that was where the traction really kind of got going in terms of where the investors were really asking. And I do have to say, I put a lot of that down to the NGOs and they got smart. And there's somebody who's also big in the sustainability space. You'll know her, Chris, Laura Brooks. She said, always follow the money. And once you know where the money goes and the money is being decided, that's where you can influence. So, yeah.
Go ahead, David.
So I very much share your admiration for Mark Moody Stewart. He's one of my great heroes. And for anyone who's interested, he wrote a super kind of part business manifesto, part memoir about responsible leadership, where he's talked many of the big challenges that he's faced, and he still continues to be active. I've worked with him closely in the Institute of Business Ethics for the last...
We do need to get Sir Mark on the pod, David. We should do that.
We do. If he's watching or listening, you have an open invitation, Mark. But let's turn to the present, if we can, and get some perspectives on where we think we're at today. Because I've just come back from a fascinating gathering down in Cornwall in the Eden Project with something called Anthropy, and we did a series of round tables with chief sustainability officers and heads of sustainability, asking them about the evolution of the field and the evolution of the specialist function, but also where are we today, where are we likely heading to, etc. And there was quite an interesting kind of division. On the one hand, a lot of people saying, yes, we've changed on the language, we're maybe repositioning how we term some things, but otherwise it's full steam ahead. And some others saying, actually, we're really facing some very, very strong headwinds. It's very, very challenging. It's not looking as positive as we're hearing other people around the round table say. So be interested to know, Froydis, Manuel, where you see the balance today from your particular vantage points.
Well, I think that one of the words that I'm hearing quite a lot over the last month, probably a year and a half, is backlash. Backlash against sustainability. It's just, and somehow the profession is a kind of downer. It's kind of, people feel that, oh, what's going on here? And well, I'm not really an optimistic person. I'm more try to be pragmatic. And based on what we just discussed, I mean, the progress that we've made over the last decades, for me, the real shift is that the field is moving from is shifting to a more mature phase, and again, I'm back to what you just mentioned on context. I mean, we know how challenging and how tough the context is out there. I don't need to mention all the geopolitics, regulations, growth, trust erosion, and we can keep going for the rest of the podcast. So mature, to me, if we put it in an analogy, we are moving from being an adolescent into adulthood. Let's put it that way.
And adolescence is much better. We all know that. So it's that's why it's so hard to grow up.
Yeah. So the question is not only what we can do or report, is whether if the organizations are going to be able, because you are in an adulthood and we know how tough could be that period of time in your life and in organizations, how we will be able to operate under challenging conditions and pressure. Because this is not only, when I'm talking to peers in organizations, not chief sustainability officers, but different functions, procurement, and everybody's facing the same challenge. It's common. So we need to embrace it, and we need to go with it and take what is the best things we can do with the situation. Because to me, the good news is clear that sustainability still matters. And we have examples where in the US administration, they're quite against sustainability, but we know corporations keep working on it. To me, that's the real proof that, okay, well, there is a real business value because those CEOs and boards are betting for it, even if they're not that on the narrative, they're not so public with what they do. So to me, that gives me the confidence. I mean, when it's happening, even if it's hidden or they're not talking too much about it. So to me, now that this how we can call it not backlash. Well, there is backlash because there is pushback, but probably recalibration. How we are going to recalibrate, but also being a little bit more not simplistic, but let's go to the core of the issues. I think we've been growing too fast, in some cases too complex. I mean, even for me, it's difficult to follow all the frameworks, everything that is going on, all the news, all the thought leadership. So how we can go back a little bit into basics and really in this period of time focus on the things that matter and deliver the highest impact in a given organization.
Then let's talk a little bit, because Froydis, you referenced when following the money is easy and investors were starting asking questions, everyone has to listen, automatically and enthusiastically. So that's great. That has changed, right? There's conversations of there's less questions and engagement from investors for different sectors, different companies, and different geographies. It depends, but that has waned a little bit from my sense of understanding. I think even to your point, Manuel, that NGOs were so important. They're also less effective than they were before because, again, the maturation. So we're not in that moment where that ecosystem was all working in the right direction. It was a heyday, but and in that context, I do worry about many companies. Given the backlash and the headwinds, its success is maintaining rather than accelerating. And so how do we rekindle that sense of ambition in this more challenging context, especially after having the luxury of a number of years ago where things were all working in the right direction, more or less?
I think for me, I agree 100% with what you said, Manuel. I sort of put some notes down before this podcast, and it was about we kind of got to go back to basics and simplicity. And the backlash for me, not just in sustainability, but in DEI, I have to say, I was really quite shocked at how quickly that elastic snapped back, just generally. And, I'm a bit more, in my down times, I go, but a bit like you, Manuel, you kind of have to reflect back and go, actually, we have achieved a boat ton over the last, 10 years, 30, 20 years. So we need to kind of make sure that we're building on those foundations because they're still really solid. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I had this kind of schizophrenic appreciation for CSRD. On the one hand, I was like, yay, these people care about it and we need to do it. And it's going to force the organization to actually get some proper data and to report it. And on the other hand, it's like, oh man, that's my accountability. And it's going to be so hard. Right. But I think that was a real example of how things just went a bit bonkers in terms of how these frameworks, these reporting requirements were sort of just developed, just sort of literally just like vomited out there. And then businesses that have to be like, okay, we have to road test this. How does it work? As opposed to having some really proper conversations about what is going to be most effective. How do we push these things forward? The number of certification programs, I mean, great. I really want to support them, but at the end of the day, that's also a boat ton of work as well. And so it's kind of like, what is the end objective? And then how do we best get there? And, from being inside extractive corporates for a long time, trying to tell people what they need to do is not often the best way. And I think it's about going back to those fundamental kind of, and again, it's not as sort of basic as follow the money, but a bit like you were saying, Manuel, at the very beginning, we were talking about risk. And just because we're not using the word sustainability, which I think a lot of people, it meant all sorts of things to different people. We didn't have that sort of aligned kind of definition. But going back to risk, just because sustainability's gone away doesn't necessarily mean the risks associated with not doing it have gone away. And so this is what I was trying to say as well in the organizations I work with. Let's go back down to basics. What are the risks to this project? And in a mining project, water is key. You need water for processing. If you are impacting a community's water, they will let you know about it. So you can not do something, but believe you me, you will have protests. The government will come and shut you down. There'll be all sorts of things that happen. So it's in your risk interest to get this right. And I remember I've sat on investment committees for probably the last sort of 20 years. And doing the evaluation of a lot of projects. And of course, I'm there, and for years and years, we had this in your sector, Manuel, it was called the non-technical risk. So they called all of the sustainability stuff non-technical, even though, community engagement, environmental management, these are hardcore technical things, climate monitoring. But again, it was articulating those risks in the language that they understood. So you don't do this, or you don't manage this risk, this is what the implication is going to be. Or the cost of managing this risk will be X. If you don't manage it, your burn rate for the day will be X times whatever. And so I think...
And in that place, like sometimes sometimes that seems obvious, but sometimes they didn't connect the dots. Is that what the reaction? They didn't see that outcome as a potential risk?
And I think as, being in the sustainability space, often, we've got people who haven't come up through the corporate space, right? So again, it's like any stakeholder engagement. It's like learning how to understand each other and then actually be able to understand each other. So, I'm the first one to admit it. I've been in exco meetings trying to present something, and I'm thinking, man, I am knocking it out the park, and I have all these blank faces, and I'm like, oh man, I did not land that. And so again, I think it's about how do we get back to those basics around risk management. Really, that's the kind of thing that a lot of corporates understand. And then how do we how do we continue to emphasize the importance of this work, to your point, Chris, as value creating? So, for example, in the mining sector, rehabilitation of mines and the mine footprint, that's tomorrow's problem. If I'm running a mine, it's like, I don't want to think about that. That's when we close. I don't want to do that. But in some instances, if you don't do the rehab, which you should have done according to the permit, the government will change. So you might have had a very sympathetic government before, but now there's a different government. And that new government might be like, you know what? We actually want you to fulfill your obligations. And if you don't, we're not going to give you a new permit for this other mine that you want to operate. So all of a sudden, guess what? Something that nobody really cared about or thought was a risk is all of a sudden a growth is going to inhibit your ability to grow. So actually, we need to find some way to manage this. So again, I think being able to frame it in those risk contexts is really important. And then I think really trying to keep it as, and I say this from personal experiences, keeping it as neutral as possible. Because again, getting very emotive about some of these things when you're dealing with very sort of, logic, brain-orientated people making decisions, it's just not the right way to land your message. And I think, again, now we've always had to be smart in the sustainability space, but now I think, again, with the context changing, we have to be doubly smart in how to articulate the value that this work really does bring.
So I'm now hearing some really critical skills for sustainability professionals today. So that ability to be able to explain what we're doing in relation to enterprise risk management, the link to value creation. And maybe I can say it more easily than Chris can, but GlobeScan and partnering with BSR have just done a really interesting, valuable paper around from the business case to value enhancement, which if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I do generally highly recommend. The other skills I think I heard you saying there, Froydis, were being able to speak the language of the different business functions and being able to really relate what we're talking about absolutely back to what is material for the business, which really requires a deep understanding of the business, and definitely not to be preachy, but to be very, very pragmatic about risks and opportunities. Any other kind of really critical skills that we're seeing today? One of the things that came out of the roundtables down in Cornwall was the ability to have a kind of a time literacy, as John Elkington refers to it, the ability to be able to think in different time frames. So on the one hand, yes, you do have to be mindful of the next quarter's figures and targets, but at the same time also having a very long-term time horizon as well. So any other kind of critical skills that we would think is really important?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of important points has been touched here. I think the question becomes whether the organization can make sound decisions, factoring sustainability on it, and how are they going to be able to manage those trade-offs? Because there is going to be always a cost and risk.
Yeah.
It's going to be short-term, long-term. I mean, it is going, and that's why I think in a lot of cases, the sustainability gets deprioritized because there is no competence to understand exactly what's going on, or basically they don't know how it fits. Or we as a sustainability professionals, we are not able to really put it in the what you just said, in the context that they can understand in their language. So I think that's this is critical. Over the many years, I think the trade-offs is where I think, and decision is where you can really make a big difference. So many times when you can see, you have a new distribution center. Oh yeah, so great, and but nothing was in the specs, and when it was built, no any energy efficiency was considered. And it's kind of, okay, well, so how do you expect to manage this efficiently for the next 15 years? Well, it was the previous executive team who did that. All right, fine. But they're not there anymore. They have a new one. And in terms of capabilities, timing, I think that this long-term view, I think is important, but also more on an operational point of view, I think that timing is also critical to understand exactly what's going on in the business. Because I've seen so many good ideas that it was not the right moment. I remember talking about second-hand clothing early in the 2000s, early. Oh yeah, we can do it. It was not the right. I mean, people were not ready. Now it's mainstream. I mean, it's happening. Everybody is good with it. So I think the timing is going to be or dry now if you're under cost pressure, or as sustainability professionals, we need to understand how to manage that agenda and be flexible to drive it. Because sometimes a good idea can be killed, and maybe it will take you a long time before you can put it on the table. So you can use very wisely those moments. On top of the skills that I think that are important is to, I think it has been mentioned, but it's internal and external networks. But not in a way, I've heard a lot. Now I want to be a little bit critic when, we need to be friends of the business. We need to get their allies. We need to, and I feel a little bit, I don't feel very comfortable with this approach. I mean, you need to bring the value at the table. Of course, if you do it in a nice way, and that's perfect, of course, but we are not a second-class function. We have our importance, and you need to put that value at the table, and you need to make them or make the business peers or leadership to look at it.
That's such an important point, Manuel, because I think sometimes the caricature of this moment is like, it's all about the business value, and we've got to just be a slave to just a few mantras that are the caricatures of how businesses run. But there is something here around the obligation and responsibility and the opportunity to shape the business. Go ahead, Froydis.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, I mean, I think that the skills area, there's a couple of things I'd add to what Manuel said is understand governance if you're in a PLC. Yep. Because your board can be your best friend, because the board actually has a much longer term view sometimes than the executive committee. So I think understanding the corporate governance structures and where the accountability really sits. And of course, just like you said, David, the enterprise risk really sits at the board level. So again, I think that's a really important skill for people in the sustainability space. Something I came to when I was doing all the climate pieces as well. Because again, I think just understanding what their obligations were and helping them understand, they were then another influencer into helping shape the business. The other one, I think, just building on that sort of other skills is I always said to my teams when we're talking to the business, you said this before, Manuel, is keep it pragmatic. Like if you're at when I was in HSC, you're at an operation, you have 99 problems, of which this highfalutin sustainability stuff is not one of them. Like you are keeping safe, you are digging stuff out of the ground, your equipment keeps breaking down, you've got a maintenance schedule. Like here comes this team going like, hey, and they're like, I don't like, how are you going to help me? And so keeping it, so I said, you need to, when you go into the operations, you can't just say, tell them off. It's like, hey, how can I help you? What's your biggest challenge that you're really, having to deal with? And how can we really lean in to support you? And then how do you then have these data-driven, risk-based decisions? So talking in sort of abstract data terms, especially around climate, is really, really hard for a lot of people, especially operations concerned. But to your point, Manuel, like you said, if this is going to save you, however many kilowatts, that translates into dollars and cents. So actually showing people how these things can kind of really, really relate. And then I think those kind of things, we are really bad. And I don't know, every time I say this, and I can put my hand up and say I suck at this, is we're really bad at keeping our case studies. So we sometimes capture some really great ones and like, oh my God, we must capture that. And we might write it up as a paper or talk about it in a podcast. But I think really, so many organizations I've worked in, like, we're a learning organization. I'm like, really? Really? And again, I think, it's really incumbent in the sustainability team or HSE teams is let's just really keep track of some of these things.
To have the discipline of documenting.
Yeah, and then you can, because in the HSE space, we do it with fines, we do it with, fatalities, we do it with really significant incidents. Why can't we do it on some of these other areas where, I had a great head of environment at Rio, and, he had his own little spreadsheet, which captured all of the kind of legal fees. He sort of did a thumb suck on legal fees that, were required around, managing some of the incidents. And again, when you can start bringing that out and showing, again, to your point, David, on the trade-off, it's really interesting. It's then you start to kind of get it down to the nuts and bolts, and that value piece becomes very, very crystallized as well.
And can I ask?
Go ahead, Manuel.
Let me bring only one that now came to my mind. With I think it's not very. It's not very popular, but I think that we need to talk more about it, which is about power. How you work in power in your structure, in your governance, who they are, what you need to do. It's not a skill that it brings you through experience and observation, but I think it is critical. It's critical. And there is not a framework, there is not a masterpiece for that. I think that you need to. But I've seen so many times that just power move things. And it's not about being more likable to people, but it's just understanding what are the power dynamics. Not culture, which is can be related, but it's just pure power. And I've been in meetings where you get executives just fighting and you say, oh yeah, well, I can go that way. And later on in the background, it's a completely different picture. You need to understand what is in front of you. Maybe I spent 11 years in Asia. Now I went through quite a lot of situations where what you have in front of you is basically know what is happening in the background. You need to learn all of this.
We need a Machiavelli for sustainability professionals.
And that's why I think it can be perceived as not Machiavelli, but at least to understand, because we are a purpose-driven professionals. So it's for good. So basically, if you can also use those resources in order to drive that impact and achieve what you want and influence in the way that it has to be, being ethical and keeping all of this, I think it is critical. But I don't hear a lot of people talking about power. And I think that's a critical point.
I love that, Manuel, because it is about, the stakeholder landscape and who's going to make the decision and how you influence them. And so often I'm like, actually, I'm not the right person to deliver this message. So it's like looking at who influences the decision maker, and that might not be you and things like that. I worked in the exploration space for a long time. So, drilling to find resources. And I always said to the geologists, when when they were looking to do stakeholder engagement with the community. I'm like, you don't just rock up and go, hi, I'm here, take me to your chief. I was like, you need to understand, their customs. You need to, do a bit of homework beforehand. And I said, it's like geology. You don't just put a drill rig on somewhere and just, drill a hole and
randomly.
Like in the glaciers, you need to take samples to understand exactly what's going on.
You do your geophysics, you do your sampling, you've got a pretty good map before you actually do it. And again, I think you're absolutely right, Manuel, is to move the agenda forward in any function, right? Sustainability, human resources, DEI, HSE. You need to really understand both that external context, because that's what the decision makers, that's their context, but then also the power dynamics within those contexts as well.
Another dynamic that I'd love to hear from both of you, because you both have this wealth of global experience and being in other parts of the world. And maybe, Manuel, beginning with you, because you spent a lot of time in Asia. You're in Spain and you're in Europe now, but you were in Asia for how many years?
In Asia, 11 years.
11 years. So how do you see is it the same dynamic, same conversation, or is the geo-context changes things quite a bit?
I've been working with Asia even before, but it's not the same traveling over there and doing your work and back and being there. So it changed quite a lot, your understanding. And you need to learn how indirect culture looks like. I mean, it's not the same. Just, for example, Spaniards, we tend to be more direct, or a Dutch person, or a Japanese, or a Chinese. I mean, it is just a completely different ball game. So you need to adjust very much to what you have in front of you, and you know that you need to play that game, or you need to play that role. Otherwise, it's not going to be successful. And for example, in Asia, trust is critical. Maybe it's going to take you to build that trust, but if you gain that trust from those individuals, it stays for not forever, but it stays for a long, long time. So I think that you need to keep those things in mind. One of the things when I was relocated to Asia, on top of at that point of time, I was managing the value chain, what we call it at that point of time globally. But we needed at that point of time more connectivity for our commercial teams of translating our sustainability product program into marketing in Asia. And basically there was a big challenge, because you can approach Japanese market. I said, waterless, clean water. And it was kind of, so what? Yeah, it's clean water. So, but it was a completely different than a Chinese or a Thai or a Singaporean or other countries where didn't care at all, because the poverty levels were low and for them it was just about survival. So I think that culture on top of power are critical things that you need to master. And the challenge is that you need to master through exposure. So that's why I'm trying. My teams, I tried always to give them that type of exposure in terms of development, not training in a book, but just, take a plane, go there, give me those results.
Experience.
Taking some control risk. Yeah.
You've taken lots of planes, Froydis. Spent a lot of time in Africa and Latin America too, and all your work. Well, what's your takeaway on the geographical importance?
100%. I mean, we operate in a global world now, and the context is, I think it's such a big world, but the context is becoming much more closer, I think, if that makes sense. So, it used to be something happened in this part of the world, and if you were here, nobody really cared. Whereas now, it's so much more interconnected. I totally agree with Manuel. I think the only way you're able to really understand cultures is to be exposed to them and spend time in them and be the outsider and actually own that. And of course, with that is a huge sense of sort of humility that, you need to go into these situations as well. And I think, I've done a lot of work in communities. So lived and worked in communities in Papua New Guinea, South America and places. And again, nothing humbles you like being in the jungle somewhere for quite a long time and being very dependent on your hosts effectively. And I think that really helps you just understand the context in which business operates these days. When I was, coming into some of my senior leadership roles, taking on a team, inheriting a team, and, I would be in meetings where they would make a lot of really pejorative comments about partners that we had. And I was like, hang on a minute, have you actually been to that site? And like, oh, no, I've just seen the statistics. And I'm like, okay, well, you can't make those kind of comments until you've actually spent time on the ground and you really understand their context. So you cannot project your reality until you've actually, really got that sort of empathy and, walked a day in their shoes. And I think one of the things we really need to understand, and in some ways it makes me quite hopeful, is what China's doing in the sustainability space. I mean, Manuel, you're probably much more versed than I am, but in my last role, I got to work with some really big parastatal companies in China, and I was just unbelievably impressed by what they're doing. And of course, it's not called sustainability for them, it's business. Right. So, the fact that they've got renewables to help, energy, it's not about energy costs for them so much, it's about energy security, right? I'd have these conversations on the health side, how do you run some of these refineries with your, what PPE are you using? And they sort of look at me and go, PPE? Why would we have PPE? There are no people in these facilities. So of course they've gone full automated. And even, when you walk around these facilities, they're super clean, they're super modern. It's amazing. And then, water, what they're doing in the water space now, because for them, water is such a, critical resource and the way they're managing water. And then most recently I was talking to them about nature. And of course, out of Montreal, Kunming, there's been this big commitment about nature in China, and talking to some academics there and what they're doing. It's amazing. So I think there's a very sort of, I dare to say it, sort of Anglo-Saxon Western arrogance that I think is still in the sustainability space as well. We know better. We're going to tell you how to do this, as opposed to actually really understanding local context. Because, you need to really understand those contexts to understand what people care about and what their priorities are. Because there's no point in saying we're going to put our social investment into X because we think you need that, when the community's like, dude, we don't need that. We've got to get up to this level first before we can have this. And, some of my big aha moments have really been going in with all the prejudices that we come in with ourselves from our own backgrounds, and just really working hard to suspend them so that then you can be really open to those opportunities. And for me, nature is the next really big space for that, especially, one of the things we were looking at doing is working really closely with Indigenous custodians and traditional owners of the land, because they've been curating that land for millennia. So why would you not want to ask them, how do you do rehab in the best way? So I think, again, really trying to open up and understand the world better is going to give us more appropriate solutions for specific contexts.
It's a perfect way to end. Thank you so much, Froydis. Thank you, Manuel. Really appreciate all the wisdom you've shared today and all the great work you've been doing over these 3 decades, each of you. Started when you were 12, both of you, and under dire circumstances. But what a wonderful conversation, and thank you very much. And thank you, you too, David.
Thank you for having us.